Hello, everyone. In today's session, we're talking to Caroline Roodhouse from Daddy Blackbird. So Caroline is an author, speaker, and advocate, transforming how we talk about suicide, grief, and healing. And she talks about her husband's suicide and how that has led her from personal tragedy into this mission about talking about hope, humanity with honesty. So Caroline, do you want to give us a quick introduction of you and your business?
Yeah, thanks so much, Dan. Great to be here. Great to be asked on this. Such an important topic to be talking about. So my background is in internal communication. Everything I do revolves around communication. And I always worked in internal comms with all sorts of different organizations in different industries. And then in November 2018 was, as you mentioned, when my husband took his own life. And I kind of got thrust into this world of suicide postvention, the support given to people after something like this has happened. And that ended up combining very naturally with the internal comms work that I do, to the point where I now specialise in internal comms, but particularly around suicide awareness, whether that's prevention, intervention or postvention, mental health support, wellbeing, and the broader subjects that go alongside it.
What led you to go from someone, a family member experiencing suicide, into wanting to be much more proactive into helping other families with hopefully prevention, but also postvention?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there were various moments that defined that shift. One of them being I was very conscious that Steve had experienced working in a toxic environment, which had taken a massive toll on his self-confidence, self-esteem. I knew through the work that I did what a positive culture should look like. And Steve absolutely did not experience that. And I saw the impact that had on him. And I know that that contributed to his suicide, which drove me to want to change that wherever possible and make sure people are aware of the significant impact of workplace bullying, for example. In my own experience, going back to work after compassionate leave, I had tons of support, loads of encouragement, loads of time off, loads of patience. Unfortunately, that didn't last. And eventually the working relationship broke down because the understanding of my situation and how my life had changed beyond recognition, how being a double parent, for example, impacted the work that I do and the opportunities I could do. And I saw the impact on me then individually. And I didn't want this to happen to other people. I wrote a book called Daddy Blackbird, and I'll talk about that later. But so many people have got in touch with me talking about their own experiences of work and how things could be better. And all of those experiences have come together to drive this passion for me to go into organisations and make sure that we're creating spaces for people to enjoy the work they do, to feel safe, to have a shit day sometimes, and for that to be okay, and for them to be supported as human beings rather than just employees. And that just continues. The more I learn, the more I understand about this topic, the more organisations I communicate with. So it's something that I live and breathe.
Amazing. I think a lot of companies would probably look at suicide as a thing that it just happens. We've got to live with it, and it's not anything that we can really influence. But you have a different view. And you're the author of the Practical First Steps Guide to Suicide in the Workplace. So that's supporting the British Standard, so 30480. Can you give us a quick rundown of what's contained in that?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a total career highlight to write that guide, actually. The British Standard was launched in November 2025, and alongside it, you can imagine it's a huge document. There's so much information in there. It's gold dust and it's the first of its kind, but it can come across as quite overwhelming. 60 odd pages, loads of annexes, all sorts of information that people from all different organisations will need, but it's overwhelming. So I was asked to write the First Steps Guide, which has 5 first steps to implementing the standard. And that could be for a sole trader or an SME, all the way up to large corporates and global organisations. And that involves everything from senior leadership endorsement all the way through to postvention planning and how we deal with a suicide that's taken place in the workplace or an employee that's sadly experienced a suicide within the family and how we support them when they come back to work. I think when we talk about whether organisations should care about suicide. And sometimes the opinion is that's a personal issue, that's something that families should be dealing with. That's a very narrow-minded view, in my opinion. Can either improve the situation for people if they are struggling or they have experienced a loss, or they can be a barrier and they can make it significantly worse to the point where people will leave, or to the point where people sadly end up taking their own life if they're struggling in that environment. And there's so much that organisations can do to make a difference there. I mentioned my book earlier. When that was published, I started to receive messages from people who were reading it saying things to me like, I struggle every day with my mental health. I have thoughts of suicide, but I can't take my own life because of the impact it would have on my family. I've seen what it's done to you and your family. I've read about it, and I'm not prepared to do that to my family. And I was overwhelmed by those sorts of messages to begin with. But I felt that people need to hear this, and organisations need to know that we've got somebody, for example, let's call him Dave. He's read my book. He's on the edge. He's travelling into work. He's feeling suicidal. He steps in through the office doors. What is the welcome that he receives? What's the culture like? How do people talk to each other? Do people ask if you've had a decent weekend? Do people talk about what they're doing that evening? Do people support each other with projects if they're struggling? Do senior leaders talk about their own mental health, for example, and normalise these conversations? Or is this all stuff that's tucked under the carpet where people like Dave aren't allowed to talk about this and aren't allowed to raise concerns or aren't allowed to be themselves? And I feel that that's a massive opportunity for organisations to look at the way that they behave and the way that they lead on this sort of stuff, and make the environment somewhere that people like Dave, you, me, whoever that is, can actually, I'm not talking about thriving, I'm talking about existing as a human being and being respected and cared for.
You've touched there on a number of behaviors which are very empathic. And I think what people want in a workplace is empathy. And there's this balance between empathy and well-being. So very often people want empathy, but what they get is a ping pong table. So what are measures that a company could implement for that? Because it almost seems like there's a big culture shift, or really almost like an awakening that's required for people to actually think about that. It's not something which a traditional business would necessarily have provisions for, which I guess what the standard is there to help. But what are things that companies can practically do for that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea of the ping pong table or the fruit bowl or the bean bags is an interesting one, but it's not going to make a difference to people. We need to be treated with respect. We need to be treated as human beings. We need to be acknowledged for the work that we do, for the effort that we put in. We need to feel psychologically safe when we come into work. And all these things come down, in my opinion, so much of the time to communication and the way that things are talked about, the way that we're able to share our opinions and ideas, the way that we're heard when we speak up at work or pushed down and our opinions are rejected or not listened to. I think a lot of it comes down to relationships between people like line managers and their direct reports. Quite often managers are put into these positions because they understand the organisation, they know how the processes work, but are they able to manage people? Can they show empathy? Do they care? Are they compassionate individuals? Do they consider everything beyond the functional stuff that has to happen in the workplace? So are we looking at the way managers behave? Are we training them in the right way? Are we giving them opportunities to go and do things like mental health first aid courses, to do active listening courses, those sorts of things? So again, communication and understanding what people need as human beings, not just employees.
Talking about that, I think some of our earlier guests have spoken about the focus that companies need to apply on a process. So where companies have designed a reliable process, we always talk about, does the process work rather than the blame? And that was very much from sort of a productivity standpoint. But it seems that that same conversation could be applied over here. Are we talking about a process working properly, or do we put pressure on the individual working in that process? So that seems to be an easy shift to take. And I think one challenge that people might have is considering productivity. Where is someone more productive? Is it in a workplace where they're put under heaps of pressure, or is it in one which they're given the tools and necessary support to be able to achieve? And I think that maybe there's some work required in terms of thinking about how people think about productivity and creating a workspace for people to be successful in. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And I think a lot of the time we aren't taking into account the particular strengths and qualities that individuals have. They may be part of a process, but if they don't have the right strengths to be able to fulfill that process effectively, and they aren't understood by the supervisor or whoever's managing that process, then there's going to be some breakdown in communication, isn't there? And that they're not going to thrive in that position. And again, it comes down to communication, having conversations, having one-to-ones, understanding what challenges people are facing within those processes, understanding where they're doing really well, where they're enjoying the work that they're doing, where they're thriving and adding value to that and being acknowledged for that value that they're adding.
Big is that acknowledgement piece in someone's well-being at work?
It's massive. I mean, it comes up in every conversation when we're talking about line manager behavior or senior leadership behavior. I'm not talking about praising individuals every day, giving them a sticker and a pat on the back just for turning up to work, but acknowledging when people go over and above, showing that the effort that they put in is valued. And that's not necessarily just from line managers or leaders. That's peer-to-peer acknowledgement as well, and encouraging a culture of that where people can acknowledge one another and recognize the effort that people put in when they come to work.
So real empathy is understanding what those individuals experience during the workday. Because I think very often with organizations, we tend to pile on new processes, new clients, new expectations, new bits of software or different work environments. And we don't anticipate, or we don't consider what that experience means to the individual. What does their workday look like? They now have an extra report to print and the printer's a mile away or the inks run dry. And sometimes it's little small things that cause someone to have a moment or a breakdown.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's that real empathic piece about being with someone and understanding what they do. I think that is a big change. In terms of productivity, what would an empathic workplace look like? Do they tend to be more productive or less productive than one that isn't?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. We talk about high-performing cultures and organizations and how those people are managed and led. And I think when people are allowed the space to be creative, to be themselves, to bring their whole selves to work, which is a phrase that I know is overdone, but is still absolutely relevant, and to be acknowledged for the qualities they have and the value that they bring, that's when we can be productive organizations. That's when you'll get the most from people, when they feel heard, seen, valued, not just as an employee, but as an individual, as a human being, as a father or mother or parent as well, with their own lives and their own challenges and their own triumphs that need to be recognized as well.
We talk about prevention. So what does prevention look like? Because very often companies think, suicide's not something we want to talk about. It's awkward, it's difficult. And if we just hide it, it goes away. So to what extent should companies be open and forward and proactive in talking about it?
I think that's the key word is proactive. If you look at something like the British Standard, it's broken down into 3 sections. We've got prevention, intervention, and postvention. And a lot of people misinterpret the word prevention, and they assume it's when somebody has disclosed that they're struggling with their mental health and they're considering suicide, and what the hell do we do with that situation? And we need to prevent them from taking their own lives. However, prevention is much more about creating a culture where people don't get to that point, where we're creating spaces that people can, again, be themselves, that people can have their ups and downs without traveling down the road where there's no turning back, and we get to that intervention crisis point. So prevention is a whole different cultural piece. It's all about how senior leaders are talking to their organizations. It's how we communicate 2 ways, not just broadcasting information, but giving people the opportunity to share their opinions and their thoughts and experiences and their stories and their lives. It's about making sure that people have the right sort of working relationships with the people around them, making sure that we're providing the right sort of support mechanisms, whether that's your EAP or external signposting to organisations that can support people with particular challenges. So it's a whole conversation piece around culture. And that's one of the things that I love about the British Standard, is that there's a huge section before we even start talking about this crisis point that people think about when they're talking about suicide prevention. It's making sure we don't get to that point in the first place, or do everything we can proactively as a whole organisational approach before we reach that point of crisis.
How do we create workspaces that allow that? Because there's a big requirement for companies to provide a psychologically safe environment for people to be able to actually feel that they can address that. Now, in some cases, it might be someone's line manager that leads them into a position where they feel like that, and they're the last person on earth they'd want to actually talk to. So what does it look like in a company where it's safe to talk about someone's personal feelings around suicide?
A lot of the time that comes from the top. It will be leaders role modeling that kind of behaviour. And in the work that I've done in the past, we've done some brilliant case studies where we've talked to organisations. For example, I talked to one in particular where I did some interviews and focus groups with individuals who were talking about the lack of communication and how they weren't listened to and how they weren't seen and heard, and how they weren't hearing from senior leaders. So they didn't know who it was that they were working for and what they were doing and what their purpose was. And I think they felt very lost. I asked several of them, what made a difference to you? What has made a difference to you? And they all replied with the same thing. Back in the days of COVID, the senior leaders set up this channel where they would do short videos talking about their own lives, talking about the challenges they were facing at home, talking about the impact that had on work. Suddenly they became human beings as well. Suddenly they became vulnerable individuals who faced their own challenges, faced their own issues with their families, and they felt normal. And all of a sudden, they felt this connection, not just with that senior leader, but with the whole workplace. And then as soon as COVID was over, the videos stopped. So that's just an example of how the power really of leaders communicating the fact that they are human beings, which then just gives everybody else permission to do the same. If you have a senior leader saying, yeah, I had a challenge, I had an issue, I spoke to so-and-so, I worked my way through it, I had support from so-and-so, I had help from these people, and then I ended up in a better place. Sharing stories like that is so powerful, and that's just one way.
So that's the authenticity of humanity coming through, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And then allowing other people to do the same, it just automatically gives permission for other people to do the same.
You talked about purpose in terms of that being a big part of someone's feeling as to how they feel about work. So if they're part of a team that's got a purpose and has a mission, one presumes that embodies some sense of meaning and value into what they do. And without that, it's quite hard to really judge what their value is. How important is that mission piece and being part of a team that's got a defined purpose?
Yeah, I think it's critical. We all need to feel that the work we're putting in has value and has meaning and is ultimately going towards achieving something. And that may be the whole company purpose. There may be some really strong values that support that. There may be behaviours that uphold those values that people are able to see happening in the workplace every day in every function. But like you say, it may come down to the purpose of a particular team or a particular project, or somebody might be part of an employee resource group or a network that focuses on a particular point, whether that's mental health or whether that's menopause or whatever that might be. But for people to be able to find a purpose within the workplace, whether that's a professional or a very personal one, will go a long way to them feeling that this is somewhere that they belong. It's somewhere that they feel safe.
In terms of a company and the duty of care, as the Health and Safety at Work Act implies for British companies, and it's really powerful legislation. And I wonder to what extent companies recognize and realize the extent to which legislation's moving towards implying that duty of care for someone's mental health and emotional safety as well as they do the physical safety, because I think the physical safety side is really well recognized.
Mm.
And it goes back to conversations I remember having with a previous boss of mine in an oil and gas project. And he relayed his personal story that he had worked on multiple companies, multiple big projects where you're employing tens of thousands of people, and had never dealt directly with anyone who had a workplace fatality. And these are, they're risky projects. They, very technically complex, and there's a lot of safety risk in there. But he did have to deal with people who'd taken their own lives. And he felt powerless because it was completely unequipped to deal with that. And I think the work that you do as an organization, as well as things like the new standard coming in, that's giving companies a real tool set to be able to deal with that and make meaningful change into what previously might just have been something that companies have had to live with.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example that you've shared there. And we've still got a long way to go if we're talking about having mental health and well-being safety perceived in the same way that physical safety is perceived, or whether we're doing a fire risk assessment, are we looking at mental health risk assessments in the same way and valuing them in the same way? There are a small minority of organisations that are doing this, and I see some brilliant examples of real proactivity, ongoing training, regular communication, not just on awareness days where we know we need to talk about suicide one day a year and then we don't mention it again till the next year. And again, things like the standard are helping to draw attention to that. The standard is not legally binding, but it's taken seriously. The last count that I looked up was actually this morning. Since it was published just a few months ago, it's now been downloaded 8,500 times by organisations in 100 countries around the world. That's really, really encouraging that people are curious. Organisations know they need to address this. I think the next step is to actually do something with it. That's what I'm seeing, is that organisations downloading this, storing it over there somewhere on the hard drive, and not actually then going on to implement the steps that are advised, and maybe taking a look at it and thinking, this can't be a priority right now. We've got this on the list over here and we're budgeting for that over there. So how do we make space for this? And I feel so strongly about this with the organisations that I work with. Many of them get this. I need to convince the organisations out there that don't get it, that sit and wait for a suicide to happen before they implement these principles from a standard like this. And I think that's something that we need to push. It's why I run the workshops that I do on a regular basis to help with the implementation of the standard. Put a 3-month plan in place. Start with small wins, small steps. And there's a lot of work that we can do around that isn't going to be overwhelming, that isn't going to break the bank. It's not going to cost a fortune. It's not going to need a whole team implementing this, but start somewhere, start small, and then build on it and use things like the standard. Leaders do have an obligation to look after the mental health of their employees. We just need that to be recognised in the same way that the obligation is there to look after their physical health too. And these standards and principles are there to help with that. They just need to be actioned.
We've spoken about prevention. What does postvention look like? Because that could be both for a company and dealing with colleagues, or it could be a one-to-one, and you deal with both. But from a business side, what does that look like for what you do?
Yeah, from a business side, I've spoken and gave that example of Dave, who is struggling with his mental health. He's having thoughts of suicide, and we're talking about prevention and intervention. Not everybody is like Dave. Some people are like my husband, Steve, who sadly did take his own life. And when that happens, the life of the people around them changes beyond recognition instantly. And it never goes back to being the same. And when workplaces recognise that, they enable that person to continue being a functioning member of society, to continue adding value to that organisation. It's a massive reputational piece as well for organisations to be looking after somebody that's been through something like this. So postvention is so important when we talk about the number of people that are taking their own lives. In the UK, for example, it's around 7,000 people a year. That equates to around 20 a day. If we think about the fact that on average, 135 people are impacted by each of those suicides, it doesn't take long to equate to 1 million people in a year impacted by suicide. And a lot of those people will be working in organisations that have nothing in place to support them. I do a lot of volunteering for the charity SOBS, which stands for Survivors of Bereavement by Suicide. And I speak to people on the support line week in, week out. Quite often, we look at the stats, and we're often surprised by the fact that people phone in during the day. And I think personally, a lot of the time that's because they're away from children, they're away from family. They feel like they can make that phone call while they're at work or in work time. But a lot of people are phoning from inside a cupboard, or they're phoning whispering because they can't tell the organization what they're going through. They don't want to show that vulnerability. They don't want to risk the next promotion not coming to them because they'll be seen as weak or grieving. They know that the support mechanisms aren't in place. I've taken calls from senior police officers, for example, who have phoned the SOB support line to say, how can you help my police officers who have been out to the scene of a suicide and they're struggling with their mental health, and they refuse to use the internal processes and HR and occupational health because of the stigma that exists around using these services and the concern that they have around their own professional development then. So there's so much stigma that exists around this. And if we can break that down and support people who are impacted by suicide, we can change the whole culture of this piece. We also know that when people have lost a loved one to suicide, they're 65% more likely to go on and take their own lives. For me, that's a very personal statistic. I have 2 children reliant on me. I can't allow myself to get into that space in the way that my husband did. So I have a huge responsibility to stay well. And if my workplace is supporting me to do that, I will give back tenfold. It comes down to employee engagement and what I'm prepared to give back. If I feel supported, I then become a very valuable member of staff to that organisation, particularly in the long term. So there's so many benefits to looking after people, but it's the right thing to do. As human beings, it's the right thing to do.
In terms of talking about the right thing to do, in any organization, even when money gets tight, I don't think you'd find a company that would cut their health and safety program for cost reasons. Like, even if things get tight, they would keep that. It would be one of the last things that a company would remove. But when we're talking about things like suicide prevention, very often it's very difficult, I think, for companies to find the money for that. And the irony is that there are far more people, it's many times a multiple of people who die by suicide every year than from workplace accidents. So the likelihood that an organization would lose someone from suicide is far greater than one from health and safety. What do we need to do in terms of prioritizing that with companies so that the suicide prevention side is seen with the same urgency, at least the same urgency as a health and safety program?
Yeah, I think that's buy-in from leaders within the organisation. I think that's people getting behind this and providing leaders with a compelling reason why we need to do that. Sometimes that's going to come down to data. If you've got the sort of senior leader that responds well to data, share some statistics with them, talk about, like you just said, the impact on organisations when somebody dies. There's a ton of this sort of stuff within the standard itself that you can lift and share with your senior leaders. For example, it's estimated that for every death by suicide, the impact is going to cost £1 million in lost effects to wider society, including workplaces. If we're really needing to get down to the finances of this, share statistics like that. Talk about the reputational impact, talk about the fact that if we're not looking after people and their mental health, the potential legal implications of that, what it's going to look like when a member of staff wants to take you to court because you've not looked after their mental well-being and they've been suffering from depression, anxiety, which should be seen as a disability if we're looking at the legal implications of that and how that person was not taken care of. Again, dealing with all of these people that phone in on the SOB support line, I'm talking to people day in, day out who were not supported. And then we have an investigation and an inquest, and workplaces are investigated through that. So sadly, it comes down to providing the data, convincing senior leaders that this is an important thing to do. And a lot of the time, the people behind that will be your HR people, your health and safety managers, the people that coordinate your mental health first aid networks, your employee resource groups that are committed to supporting people's mental health. Culture leaders, whoever that might be, is convincing that senior leader who makes those decisions that this is an important thing to do, and then disseminating that through the organisation.
You're a big advocate for changing the language of suicide, and I've seen some of your LinkedIn posts also talking about when people say we commit suicide, that's something we want to change. What are some of the examples that we could use to change the wording around how we address things to make it more acceptable or to normalize the conversation around suicide?
Yeah, I think for a start, the word suicide itself is just feared, isn't it? People will avoid saying that word or they'll whisper it as part of the conversation. I was speaking to somebody from the charity Mind recently who were going to do some workplace training for an organisation, and this was all about suicide prevention. And just before the training, one of the leaders from that organisation phoned and said, "We're happy for you to do the training, but please don't mention the word suicide because we don't want to upset anybody." And if we've got that sort of view, we're never going to break down this stigma that exists. So first of all, we need to be able to say the word suicide openly. It's a thing, it happens, and we can't hide from it. You mentioned the phrase committed suicide. That is certainly something that we're trying to remove from general language. And the reason for that is up to the 1960s, suicide was seen as a crime. And it was labelled as something bad and something we couldn't talk about, and something that person that had died had kind of inflicted on their family, almost to the extent of it being a crime. And that can have such a negative impact on the way that family is then able to process that. So we try to avoid using that word. I would never chastise someone or tell them off for using this kind of language, but just gently trying to educate people around this sort of thing. Talking about a successful suicide, for example. No suicide is ever going to be a success, but it's a phrase that's used. If somebody's completed a suicide, it's seen as a successful suicide or a failed attempt. Imagine somebody in that fragile state of mind and it's being classed as a failed attempt, and the impact that would have on that person. So it's just a lot of common sense that needs to be used around how we talk about this. Again, a lot of this is in the standard, and I talk about it on a daily basis on LinkedIn if people want to follow me on there as well, and many other organisations and individuals talk about this too. Those are kind of the big ones. And I think there's this fear that if we have a concern about somebody in particular and we're worried about their current mental state, we don't want to put the idea of suicide in their head. So we avoid saying something to them, and we might go as far as to say, "You're not thinking about doing something silly, are you?" The advice is that we need to use direct language, and instead of saying something like that, if we are genuinely concerned about somebody, it's okay to say, "Are you having thoughts of suicide?" It's not going to put the idea in their head. They're probably already thinking that anyway. But what it is going to do is give them an opportunity to say, "Yes, I am. I'm really struggling. Thank you for asking me. I need help."
In talking with people who've gone through a family member who's died by suicide or any other form of grief, what are meaningful things that people can say? Because I think very often people feel the empathy of wanting to say something, but feel very badly equipped to be able to deal with that. And, we come out with sort of empty platitudes, which, do more harm than good sometimes. So what are things that people can say that really help?
I think acknowledging the challenge of it is the most important thing. Heard a phrase that Simon Sinek used about getting in the mud theory, not trying to fix people's issues, not trying to fix what they've been through, but empathizing with them and being prepared to just be there and listen and sit in the mud with them and not doing anything more than that. And I think we often feel we want to say something meaningful or fix the situation or make things better. When it comes to loss by suicide or grief more generally, like you say, nobody can fix that. But what you can do is listen, understand, and be there beside somebody and stick around. A lot of the time when these things happen, there's a huge amount of support in the initial days and weeks, and then people just disappear. The people that really stick around for the long term continue to check in, continue to say, "What can I do to help? I'm here. Come over. Can I support you with this? I'm available to help with that." Practical stuff, but also knowing that person is still there, still sticking around. That's so valuable.
You mentioned about practical things, and in your book you talk about people who say things like, you know where I am. What are practical steps that people can take to help?
Yeah, that saying, "You know where I am if you need me," is a frustration of mine, because quite often when somebody is grieving, they don't know what they need and they're not going to reach out for help. It's the responsibility of people around them to reach in and offer practical support. I think a lot of that comes down to understanding the priorities of that particular person. So for me, for example, my priorities were my children, and I was constantly concerned about their welfare. They were 9 and 2 when Steve died, at very different ages, very different needs. And when people reached in and offered to support with the children, take them out for a dog walk, do a Zoom call to help Evie with her homework, whatever that might be, practical stuff was really meaningful to me because it took one of the jobs off my shoulders out of the millions of jobs that I had to do. But it also meant that my children were being looked after by other people, and having just lost their dad, knowing that there were people around that cared for them was really, really significant for me. So that was one thing. I think things like mowing the grass, coming round and helping with the shopping, dropping off a meal, particularly in those earlier days, but continuing to offer practical support like that. And then if we're talking about in the workplace, recognizing that people aren't going to be operating at 100% in those early kind of weeks and months, acknowledging that, talking about workloads, talking about support from other people, talking about one-to-ones, checking in, making sure people are okay. Is there anything that they need support with, and staying close to that person for the longer term as well? All very significant. And again, communication, talking to people about what they need, massive thing.
It's about reaching in, not asking people to reach out.
That's a big part of it. Yeah, absolutely. It depends on the individual and how they are responding, how they are dealing with that loss. But we can't expect them to come to us with the things that they need, because 9 times out of 10, they don't have the time, energy, inclination to do that. Reaching into people, even if you were to say, I'm going to message you every week at the same time, and I'm going to check that you're okay. If you don't feel like responding at that point in time, that's fine, but I'm going to carry on doing that. That's so significant, and it doesn't take much effort or time, but it's a commitment that you're showing to that person which matters.
You mentioned someone not being at 100%. I mean, could it be fair to say that someone's 100% after an event like that isn't going to be like the 100% that it was before? They'll be at some reduced capacity. They might be at 120%, but still doing less than what they had before the life event happened.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I was very much not 100% when I came back after Compassionate Leave because of the emotions that I was experiencing and the exhaustion that I was going through. And as time went on, I also wasn't perceived as being able to commit fully. I had young children, so I couldn't go off and do workshops or go on overnight stays for work and those sorts of things. So that was perceived as a negative against me. However, had my direct manager had a conversation about the things that I could contribute to, it would have been a very different story. I genuinely believe in post-traumatic growth. I believe that we can develop new qualities, new skills that are valuable to the workplace. You look at AI and the robots taking over. We want real people with real emotions and real experiences who are prepared to share them. And when we do get that, it's like gold dust to organizations. And it adds so much value to the idea of being human, being real. And I feel now that I can add more than 100% in the position that I'm in now. And my children are older. I have learned so much. I've got a network around me that supports me. I feel that I can add a huge amount to organizations over and above what I was able to offer before Steve died, because of the experiences I've had, because of the compassion I can now feel for people in a different way, because I've learned how to empathize, because I know what it feels like when people don't. So I think there's a huge opportunity to value what people can bring to organizations and not assume that they will stay forever broken.
Talking about the huge amount that you had to go through, can you explain what double parenting is?
After Steve died, I was the only parent, which put me in a very vulnerable position. I permanently felt like I needed to stay alive to be there for my children because I was all they had. And when we come back to language, I kind of pigeonholed myself into the single parent kind of space because I was an only parent, and I did everything for them, and I was the only person responsible for them. However, it was a friend of mine who had come across this phrase double parenting as opposed to single parenting or even sole parenting. I think when we talk about single parents, often these days, it may be that a family has separated. There's still a mum and a dad, but they don't live together and they co-parent in some way. They share the responsibility, the finance, whatever that might be. Double parenting is when you are genuinely the only parent responsible for those children, and all of those pressures are on you 365 days a year. And that is what a true double parent is, in my opinion. And that's what I've been for the last 7 years. And acknowledging that has made me take a lot of the pressure off of myself. It's made me a better parent, I believe. It's made me a lot more relaxed in terms of some of the parenting and some of the perfectionism I want to put on myself. Just the other day, Ada said to me, we were watching something on TV and the child on the TV was learning how to ride a bike. She's 9 and she can't ride a bike. There is a bike in the shed, but it's rusty and I've never had time to teach her. And it feels to me like something Steve would absolutely have done if he was here. And instead of thinking that this is something Ada's missed out on, I have to try and look at the positives from this situation and what I am able to give her as a mum, whether that's as a double parent or not. Otherwise, you just fall into this trap of what they've lost, what they're missing every day. And it's not somewhere I can afford to go.
So you've started a business which came about through the lived experience of your husband's suicide. And what advice would you give to anyone else who's got a lived experience that they form a business through?
I think there's probably quite a lot, actually. Stay true to your story, stay true to the principles of your story and what it means to you, and know the value of your story. A lot of the time, because we're working in spaces like this, and there's a lot of charities in the suicide awareness space and in the grief space, there are very limited resources, and quite often somebody with a lived experience like mine can be seen as a charity or a public support that's just available to everybody. If you're running a business, respect your own time and your own experience and the value that brings to organisations, and make sure that other people respect that too. I've had to learn a lot. I think one of the biggest things that I had to learn was all these different hats that you need to wear when you're running a business. So I'm not just out there being a storyteller. I'm also needing to do my own marketing. I'm needing to be my own finance department and send out invoices and find finances when I don't have any cash flow and all these sorts of things. I'm also having to be my own PA and manage my own diary around all the other things that exist beyond the work that I'm doing as well. So many different elements to running a business that revolves around lived experience and personal experiences as an individual, but also collaborating with others. I work really closely with lots of different organisations and individuals. The workshops that I'm running with an amazing mental health trainer and consultant called Tom Oxley, for example, and we're pooling our resources, we're pooling our energy and time. That makes a massive difference. I don't feel like I'm on my own. And he also respects my boundaries and what I'm able to achieve in the role that I do as a double parent with this lived experience. But he also doesn't underestimate the value that I can bring to that. So yeah, working with others, not being on your own, making those connections, maintaining those relationships, and not being too hard on yourself as well, I think is one of the biggest things. And respecting what you do, knowing that it's bringing massive value.
In terms of the value that you offer to organizations, then it seems that there's a lot both on sort of the team bit, so helping a team come together and be more empathic and providing a better foundation or environment for team members to be able to be themselves in. There's also, as I understand, the corporate elements. So maybe do you do guidance as well for companies with the new British standard?
Yes, absolutely. I think helping to implement the standard and the first steps of the standard is a really big part of what I do now, particularly with smaller organisations who may not have a dedicated HR function or an internal comms function. Being able to support them with implementing those 5 first steps and all of the communication that goes alongside that has become a big part of what I do. I will also do lived experience talks for organisations, and that will involve supporting mental health first aiders around that, what to expect from the conversations that may come out of that. So that's a big part of what I do as well. I do support organisations with amplifying the initiatives that they have as well. So the latest studies suggest that on average, an organisation might have 48 different mental health and wellbeing initiatives. In reality, only around 12 of them are actually known about, and only 5 of them are actually used. This is on average. Is that because the 48 are mainly rubbish and nobody's interested in them? Is it because we don't communicate about them enough, or only talk about them in Mental Health Awareness Week? Do we need to sit down with staff and run some focus groups, for example, and find out what they actually want and need and will use and will value in their organisation? And then how do we make sure that we respect the information that they give us and do something with it and implement it and share it back to the organisation, and then promote those initiatives in the right places using the right channels, not forgetting about staff on the front line, for example, all of those remote workers who might be out on a building site or driving a truck or working as an engineer on their own. How are we making sure we're communicating with them? So it all comes together depending on what the organisation needs and their different circumstances. And I can support with all of those different elements.
And see how your background as a communication specialist is really useful to this being effective in companies.
Definitely.
So in terms of the activities that you do with organizations, what could they be? Do you do workshops and talks? Is it a mix?
Yeah, it's a big mix. So I'll do talks for all sorts of organisations, and that's virtually and in person. And again, those support workshops around those. I'm now running new workshops for implementing the British Standard with organisations. Some of those are open workshops, but also specifically for organisations, individual groups within them, whether that's a whole HR team or whether that's a group of mental health first aiders, for example, or whether we're talking directly to senior leaders. So yeah, all sorts of different workshops available to help with suicide awareness more generally and implementing the British Standard.
Terrific. And in terms of other resources, so this is Caroline's book. You mentioned that before. So Daddy Blackbird, the true story of a family surviving and thriving after loss by suicide. It's one of the best books I've read in the sense that there's a real authenticity to what you're talking about. It's your real lived experience, but you framed it so well in terms of the story from horror to hope. So I think what people shouldn't expect that it's just a story about the horror of the suicide. It's the whole, how you've come from you talk about the square and moving to the triangle, you and your two ridiculously talented girls, how you've recovered from that. But also, as you mentioned before, it's a real eye-opener in terms of the impact that a suicide has on someone. And I'm so pleased to hear that that's already had effects where people rethink their plans around that. What other resources, if people wanted to get in touch with you, could you put them in touch with?
Yeah, so again, doing talks for organisations. If you want me to come in and do a talk, please get in touch around that. I've got my website. I'm on LinkedIn, posting most days about this topic and about new initiatives that are coming out all the time, and amazing organisations working alongside me doing this sort of work as well.
So your website, like your book, daddyblackbird.com. And you're very active on LinkedIn. So you actually talk about your LinkedIn in your book as well, which is, I remember reading that and going, like, I'm in there as well.
You are. You're part of that amazing network of people. And I'm so grateful to all of you.
It's very good to see. But so Caroline, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this. What I'm really pleased about is to see that there's some actual meaningful steps that companies can take. It's not just something which, fades into the background or we sweep under the carpet. In fact, much better that we address this proactively. And organizations like yours, I think, are going to really help companies empower themselves and feel empowered to be able to address that and also make meaningful change. And one thing I think, we might also need to rethink a bit more language. So there's a saying, isn't there, when people talk about angels and dark places, they say dark places where an angel fears to tread. But I think we need to reshape that because very often a dark place, it's only an angel that's in there. And, you're in there and people like you and helping people out of those dark places. And they're families today who've got their family members still with them because of the work that you do and people like you do. So a tremendous sense of gratitude for that. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. That's lovely. I really appreciate you listening today.